The internship program is just one example of the way his residents seize opportunities provided by the dedicated Operation Pathways resident service coordinators. As noted in the survey findings, the overwhelming majority of respondents believe that all levels of government, developers, philanthropy, and individual private citizens should be more actively engaged in supporting affordable rental housing. This dovetails nicely with the themes of our awards this evening. And now it's time to honor tonight's final awardee. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton has spent her entire 15-year career as the District of Columbia's representative, breaking barriers for her disempowered district and bringing unique economic benefits for her constituents. These range from her support to fully fund Section 8 housing vouchers, working to block evictions for low-level offenses, and making the eviction bar higher in communities of color. We are proud to present Representative Holmes Norton with the NHPF Industry Leader Award. Here's what the representative had to say.
It is my honor to receive this award from the National Housing Partnership Foundation for being an industry leader in affordable housing. In my work as a member of Congress, a top priority is legislation that offers crucial housing support for all Americans in need of stable housing. For example, the American Rescue Plan, which passed this year, provided more than $21.5 billion in emergency rental assistance to help millions of families keep up with their rent and remain in their homes, as well as $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers for individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness or are at risk for homelessness. As the District of Columbia's representative in Congress, I have also worked to secure funding for housing initiatives, especially in my district. This summer, I was successful in getting appropriations through the House of $3 million for the Marshall Heights Community Development Association, $500,000 for the District Alliance for Safe Housing's Corner Store Safe Housing Program, and $200,000 for Calvary Women's Services Reach Up Housing Project. Of course, these affordable housing programs that Congress funds are made possible by the housing organizations that implement them. I want to thank the NHP Foundation for its role as a provider of quality, affordable housing to 15 states and the District of Columbia for over 30 years. Congratulations on your 5th annual symposium. Each year, your organization has tackled a topic of interest to the entire affordable housing ecosystem and enriched the industry with impactful speakers, content, and industry reports. Thank you again for the Industry Leader Award. I look forward to continuing to work on providing affordable housing to the people who need it.
It is gratifying to see these powerful women doing great things in Congress for affordable housing. We are now fortunate to hear from Mayor Justin Elicker of New Haven, Connecticut, with his point of view on affordable housing vulnerability and where we go from here. A little bit about Justin Elicker. Mayor Elicker fell in love with New Haven when he arrived to attend grad school at Yale University and quickly immersed himself in civic affairs. As mayor, he has been a passionate advocate for affordable housing, fighting decades of opposition to zoning reforms that would allow for marginalized populations to live in the city. His track record includes work with NHPF on revitalizing the West River area with affordable rental townhomes. Mayor Elicker, welcome, and thank you for your time.
It's good to be here.
So, Mayor, as you know, the theme of this symposium is a decade of rental housing vulnerability, lessons learned from the financial crisis to coronavirus. And as part of this event, we conducted a survey of stakeholders in affordable housing to determine how certain programs and events have impacted affordable housing, and then what measures can be taken to ensure future affordable housing is more resilient in times of crisis. So my first question for you is, thinking about legislation and policies to support the creation and preservation of affordable housing in your own city, in New Haven, can you tell us which programs have been most effective?
So there's been a number of programs that have been effective in us revitalizing some of the existing housing stock and improving some of it to make it more accessible to people financially. The RAD program in particular, Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, has been hugely helpful to our city. The New Haven Housing Authority has used this program to basically rebuild many different historical housing that they've operated that has over the years become dilapidated into much more vibrant places for people to live that is affordable. Eastview Terrace is one, Fulton Park, Chatham, Twin Brook. There's a whole list of different housing developments that have been improved and expanded, and in many cases totally rebuilt because of RAD. I'd also just highlight the eviction moratorium and some of the pandemic relief funds have been very, very helpful for our city as well to stabilize a pretty significant potential problem that we were facing early on in the pandemic and throughout the pandemic. And the city's created a program we call Castle that helps with rental assistance for tenants that are unable to pay their bills. And the state also has a program, Unite CT. And both of those programs have helped both tenants stay in their homes, and in addition, landlords be able to cover that financial gap so that we didn't have some mass evictions throughout the city. And now, as the eviction moratorium has ended, and we're looking at that potential, this extra funding really helps us ensure that there's not just hundreds and hundreds of New Haven residents that become homeless.
Right. Yeah. And I'm curious, so those programs to help people stay in their homes, which stream of the relief funding were those funded with?
So they're through the American Rescue Plan funding, and we used the CARE Act funding early on for some of the Castle program, and then the states use American Rescue Plan funding. And it's been more challenging than one might think to get the money out there. And that's because of federal regulations and the paperwork. There's a pretty lengthy process that we're required, and as much as we try to simplify it, we're required to have people fill out. So the state has been good at actually having buses go around with caseworkers and computers in the buses to help sign people up in partnership with the city and our Board of Education. They have them outside schools, and we do robocalls and other ways to reach out to people to make it as easy as possible for people to fill out the forms.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting that we're discussing now the public sector response to the crisis of the last year plus. And so in the survey that I mentioned, our respondents strongly felt that the public sector doesn't do enough to support affordable rental housing. And so we're wondering, do you agree, Mayor Justin? And if so, what do cities need to do to increase support from a public sector? Or if you disagree, how do you counter this impression that there isn't enough public sector support?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of increasing the number of market rate availability of housing, and the public sector using the tools that we have to facilitate more access to affordable housing. And just to give you an idea of Connecticut and New Haven, so New Haven provides over 55% of the affordable housing for the entire region. And so our suburban neighbors have much more restrictive zoning that makes it very difficult for the market to create different options for people and a different kind of spectrum of availability for people of different incomes. And that's put a lot of pressure on New Haven because we're very interested in providing more and more affordable housing. Just over 30% of our population receives some sort of government assisted support for housing. That's a huge chunk, but you think about our cities providing the overwhelming majority of housing for the reason that it's affordable. We need to do more. We actually are reviewing, I've implemented an inclusionary zoning ordinance that our legislative body, the Board of Alders, is reviewing now, and presumably will support in some form. And that's a tool that we can use. They're also reviewing an accessory dwelling unit ordinance that will provide more options for single and some small multifamily homes to rent out, a garage that they convert or an attic that they convert, those sorts of things. So those are ways that government can help in addition to our direct financial assistance. But we also need to make it easier for the market to play a role here by eliminating or reducing the parking requirements, the minimum lot size requirements, those programs that we have some in New Haven still, and we're working on those, but our suburban counterparts, frankly, use a lot of those tools, I think, to reduce the likelihood that they're going to see a lot more affordable housing. We've really worked closely with the coalition to push the state to change some of those regulations and push a lot of other towns to offer more options to people and loosen their zoning codes. And there's been pretty significant pushback on that effort.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, I feel like this is something that we're really seeing across the country, that lots of cities and counties individually are taking on these zoning and regulatory issues. And it sounds like you all are approaching this not just from the perspective of what can the federal government do to help us, but how can we find and ensure the naturally occurring affordable housing that's already here through turning garages or above garage rooms into housing. So yeah, so that's great.
Exactly. And I think that, ultimately, the spirit here is that if we have diverse communities everywhere, and by diverse, it's different income levels, it's different races and ethnicities, people from all different backgrounds living together, we're going to be better people. And we're going to be creating an environment that allows us all to thrive more, be exposed to different points of views, and help support each other more. And currently, I think that around the nation, that's just not the case. We have communities that are typically for higher income, and then communities that are concentrated with individuals that are lower income, and that just doesn't create for a strong and vibrant society.
Right. And I think that's the way of the future as well. And that segues really nicely into another question from our survey findings, which is that, so in the responses to the survey, we found that government is most often cited as the stakeholder bearing primary responsibility for addressing racial and ethnic disparities. So the government is most often cited as the main driver of that. So can you offer any recommendations for how cities can improve racial disparities in housing after years of inequities, including those that we've already mentioned?
Yeah, there's a number of other things that we're working to do. And it is, oftentimes we talk about affordable housing in the context of new housing coming in, right? And New Haven's certainly seen a lot of development, and we have concerns about gentrification pushing out people that have lived here for many decades. And the inclusionary zoning code is one of the tools that we're trying to use to make sure that the development is equitable, or provides at least some component of equity. But there's another side to this, that is a lot of the existing housing stock is affordable, but just not safe to live in. New Haven has a very old housing stock, and there's a lot of issues with lead paint that creates an environment, particularly for young children, that puts them at risk. We have a lot of issues with absentee landlords that do not properly take care of their properties. So there's rodent issues, mold issues, and they don't quickly fix them. There may be fire hazards, those sorts of things. And so we're working to confront those with a change in the way that our lead inspection ordinance, the tools that our ordinance gives our inspection team to actually help, first of all, fund more inspectors by finding those properties where, if there is a problem identified and they fix it, will end up paying a fine. And by having more teeth so that we can quickly respond when there's a children with a blood level that reaches a certain threshold where there's a child in that environment, our health department will go out and address the situation very quickly, force the landlord to fix the property. We're also increasing some of our anti-blight ordinance. We have a natural persons ordinance that the Board of Aldermen is also reviewing right now that ties the landlord's name to the property. And so the landlord can't hide behind an LLC. And it gives us a better tool for us to keep landlords that may not always take care of their properties well accountable by finding that person instead of an LLC. Right. And we're upping the number of inspectors that we have to make sure that we're providing housing in this city that is safe for people and affordable.
It sounds like you all are doing a lot of really interesting and innovative and proactive things as opposed to kind of waiting for issues as they come up, or addressing them. And so I'm curious, I'd like to end with your thoughts on, as mayor, with an administration, you all can't work in a vacuum. It involves the efforts of the citizens who elected you and, those who didn't elect you as well. So what sort of advice do you have for people who are just normal people who want to do something about helping their neighbors be stably, affordably housed? How and why should people be involved in care?
I think a lot of people, and we saw this in Connecticut with a very organized initiative this past year to decrease the barriers for towns to allow developers to come in and provide affordable housing. There was a lot of pushback from suburban towns. And I think that pushback was based in part on fear of the unknown, of the idea that somehow people moving in that may not be able to afford a single family home in a 2-acre zoning environment are somehow going to negatively impact the town or municipality. Mm-hmm. If we really care about racial equity and justice, we all need to do more to live in a society where we're exposed to different people. And I think that is a key component. Housing is a key component to confronting systemic racism. If people want to do something, I think that at the local level, we as individuals have a huge influence over our own municipalities and how our municipalities become more open to the kind of housing that provides more opportunities for all different people to become our neighbors and friends. And that will make us all much stronger and help us confront issues around systemic racism.
Right. And so more and diverse housing means stronger communities, it sounds like.
Yeah, I believe so.
Perfect. Okay. Well, Mayor Justin Elicker, thank you so much for being with us. We wish you all the best and everything that you're up to in New Haven, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Thank you for organizing this.
Thanks. State housing agency partners play a vital role in the creation and preservation of affordable housing. We are all interested in their take on what has been learned in the past decade that affects how we now work to ensure more resilient housing in the next decade. Please welcome the speakers in our State Housing Agency Partners conversation. First, we have Marissa Button. Marissa was named the Director of Multifamily Programs for Florida Housing Finance Corporation in 2019. She is responsible for the oversight of the rule development, allocations, underwriting, closing, and cost certification processes for the LIHTC, SAIL, MMRB, and grant programs. And we are happy to say she has played a role in housing NHPF has developed in Florida. So welcome, Marissa. Next, Mike Hawkins currently serves as the Managing Director of Community Outreach for Virginia Housing, the state housing finance agency for the Commonwealth of Virginia. He leads a division comprised of experienced housing professionals engaged in efforts to build the capacity of housing developers and organizations to promote affordable housing. Mike and his team are also actively involved in efforts to facilitate place-based strategies that foster inclusive, mixed-use, and mixed-income communities. I'm glad to have you here, Mike. Crystal Cornegay, Executive Director of Mass Housing, is a dynamic and passionate advocate for affordable housing, administering the lending of over $1 billion annually to preserve affordable rental housing and create homeownership opportunities for borrowers of low and moderate income. NHPF recently had the good fortune to work with Crystal to acquire Blue Mountain Apartments in Boston. So thank you for joining us, Crystal. And lastly, appointed in 2019, Nandini Nachanjan is the first woman CEO of the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. An innovative and seasoned executive with affordable housing finance and capital markets expertise, Nandini is already tackling the challenges of creating Connecticut's affordable housing, and NHPF is so pleased to be creating housing there as well with Nandini. So welcome, Nandini. Thank you everyone for being here. We're very honored to have you with us and looking forward to this conversation. So let's get started. So as we discussed during this event, the theme of the symposium is a decade of rental housing vulnerability, lessons learned from the financial crisis to coronavirus. So part of solving housing vulnerability also is providing education. So for example, as part of sustainable homeownership mortgage lending models, homebuyer education plays an important role in helping to promote positive outcomes for new homebuyers. So we're also thinking about opportunities for a renter education to play a similar role to help address rental housing vulnerability. So starting with Crystal, I'd love to hear from you. If you could start us off on your thoughts on renter education as well as homebuyer education in Massachusetts and beyond.
Well, first I want to thank the foundation for inviting me to be here, and thank my co-panelists for having me be part of the crew. Rent to educate, any kind of education is a great thing, right? And it all kind of depends a lot on what are you educating people about. What we're finding as part of the coronavirus in particular is of the idea that with the emergency rental assistance funds from the federal government, a lot of residents, but as well as owners, need education around how they can participate in these programs and what it means for not just the families, but for themselves. And so the kind of education that happens ongoing is one thing, but really is like preparing people for crises. And whatever level that crisis is, like, let's hope we don't have a pandemic for another eon or something. But there are things that happen in people's lives. And so what are the resources? How should they go about that? And who can they reach out to as partners, as opposed to sticking their head in the sand and, hoping it goes away.
And how about in other parts of the country, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Florida? Have you invested in rental education where you are?
Laura, this is Mike. I'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which I think is very exciting, both in terms of the context of home ownership education, but also extending into renter education as well. We've certainly had a very robust home ownership education program, homebuyer education program in Virginia. We educate approximately 19,000 participants annually in our homebuyer education program. And so it's been a very important part of our sustainable homeownership mortgage lending model in terms of having education, fixed rate permanent mortgage financing, as well as the ability to service our own loans. And we learned certainly during the foreclosure crisis, Great Recession, how important education is from the homebuyer experience. And as we emerged out of the foreclosure crisis, the Great Recession, there was certainly a great recognition in terms of the value of rental housing and a much greater appreciation, I think, of rental housing in terms of the context of the overall affordable housing landscape. And so we moved forward with actually developing a renter education program really based on our experience with our homebuyer education program. And we started moving into the arena of what I would consider to be more holistic housing education in terms of looking at education for consumers and participants in programs, whether or not they were home buyers or renters. So we developed a renter education program with input from various stakeholders and partners involved in the rental arena. And that has proven to be very successful. Originally, that was available as an ebook on our website that could be used by our partners and stakeholders. And then that evolved into actually a free online renter education program. And we're continuing to see growth in the use of that program, and also our rental partners looking at how to utilize that program, again, to strengthen the renter experience and also to provide strong rental households over the long term by virtue of that education program.
And I'm curious, this would be a question for anybody. What are the important things for renters to know? What is it that's important to communicate to them?
I would say one thing is the value of paying your rent on time.
Mhm.
Um, and what happens to your credit as a result of not doing that, and how credit then impacts other areas of your life. So we often talk about credit, particularly in terms of first-time home buyers, but
Right.
we all know that credit impacts like what level of charge you get even for your utilities, right? Or for your cell phone. And like educating people about what that means isn't just really about educating them in relation to being a good renter, but also to to just having a full life and being able to access lots of things in the general marketplace.
Mhm.
So I'm going to jump in really quickly. So we do have a home buyer education program, like a lot of other states that are state housing finance agencies. We don't have a renter education, but we are interested in developing um, more broad-based education strategies around maintaining your home. So that could be on the home ownership side. On the rental side, I would say like things around managing your budget seems universally important for anybody who's a homeowner or a renter, because I think there are a lot of folks, like Crystal was saying, the importance of paying your rent on time. But I think but more broadly, like how do you manage your finances and live within your means? I think it's something that everyone could gain from. One thing in Connecticut that we're interested in looking at is education for partners too, like realtors and other folks that we're finding are not understanding. And it could be partly because of sort of I don't want to say complacency, but certainly a neglect of that part of our business for a number of years. And so we're starting to think about ways that we can bring education to the forefront, not just only for the folks we serve, but overall in terms of the entire housing landscape.
And as I discussed, like in Massachusetts, we are part of, like in all other states, are part of a larger ecosystem. So we don't actually do renter education, but it does happen in the state. And the education isn't just for the renter. It's also for the owner as well. And what happens if you're renting to folks with a voucher, how you actually get access to that. Are there resources that you can use to bring up the standard quality of the unit that you may be renting? And so education is not just about the renter, it's also about the landlord, the owner.
Very good. Okay, so our next question, moving on. This is about the Great Recession and sort of what we learned there. So, after the Great Recession, we saw the federal government really stepping back from some of its more successful policies, for example, from AFFH in the Fair Housing Rule. So, in our survey, an NHPF survey, we were learning that a lot of people were pointing out that many state and local leaders moved to change land use policies and create inclusionary zoning laws to help add supply, even when the law was removed. So, Nandini, we recently heard from Mayor Justin Elicker of New Haven, Connecticut, on how New Haven has leveraged federal programs like the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act and RAD in New Haven. And so, you being in Connecticut as well, we're interested, how did this movement play out statewide? Not just at the city level, but statewide in Connecticut. And what are some of the effects that you're seeing today?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I'll try to keep it succinct, but basically, so Connecticut renters struggle with some of the same challenges that are faced nationwide: housing shortage for lowest income households, NIMBYism, rapidly aging rental housing stock. I think those so the main challenges that are being faced. And then COVID has just exacerbated the disparate impact felt by communities of color and lower income households. So there is there has been a growing interest. And I think part of Connecticut's problem, and I think this is true of other states too, is that the housing isn't really adequately distributed across the state. So there are towns and cities that are just have a lot of the affordable housing, right? So they have more than their fair share, so to speak. So the legislature took up a bill this past session in trying to replicate what was done in New Jersey, where they have fair share zoning, and it didn't make it. And another proposal that would have allowed housing authorities to go beyond their immediate town boundaries, and sort of have the same level playing field as developers, or for-profit or nonprofit developers, was not successful. So there's a lot of energy behind preventing or keeping the status quo. There are some towns that are doing good things. I don't want to say that there aren't. There are towns like Avon and even Greenwich and Guilford and East Lyme and Waterford, and there's lots of forward-thinking towns that are trying to build housing for affordable housing. They're taking action, but I think there's still a lot of sort of exclusionary tactics, for lack of a better word, that are just, even with state laws like 830G in Massachusetts, it's called 40B, and it's basically supposed to allow developers to be able to get around zoning, ordinances, unless there's a sort of a material like health or safety reason. But it has led to some affordable housing being built, but overall it hasn't really had the same sort of momentum you would hope that it would have had. So for our part, the state and CHFA in particular, so we've sort of focused on a few different things. We have our QAP, which is sort of our main driver for new units in the state. And we've, in the 2022 round, or the 2022 QAP, we've done a couple things. So one of them is we intentionally made a decision to balance new units with preservation. So we do some preservation with 9% credits. And so we've said 25% for preservation, 75 new units, because we think it's important to do both, but be able to do it sort of more intentionally. And then we've adopted the state's opportunity map, which was recently updated with work done by the Fair Housing Center and the Open Communities Alliance, which are two sort of housing research data advocacy organizations. And the idea there is to really try to incentivize with points building in towns that are considered higher opportunity, so that we can try to start to move the needle to build housing in areas that are thriving from a few different perspectives. Besides that, we have like a 4% program where we're doing things with the mayor of New Haven and the housing authority, with 4% credits, with soft funds from the state, where we're trying to redevelop sort of housing authority portfolios, creating deeply targeted units with our own like proprietary funds, or the Capital Magnet Fund, which we recently received an award for. And then besides that, we realize that there are sort of large scale multifamily developments, but then there are more smaller scale developments that are going to be hard to finance using LIHTC. So for that, we've partnered with some CDFIs like LISC and others, and they're doing things where they're trying to bring technical assistance and pre-development funds to municipalities that are trying to build capacity, or nonprofit developers. We also have a loan pool that has been in existence for about 8 years, and we work with that and smaller organizations to help them acquire blighted multifamily buildings, and rehab them, and they're usually like 3 to 20 unit buildings. So it's really a varied sort of strategy. It requires working with different partners, and maybe LIHTC and not LIHTC. We have a state-sponsored housing portfolio, which is similar to sort of the public housing, but in the state side. And we've been investing resources with the Department of Housing to try to revitalize and preserve those. There's thousands of units that still need to be preserved or rehabbed. And so, we're looking at different ways to do that. Energy efficiency is important to us, and we've used qualified energy conservation bonds and federal and state historic tax credits and other ways to try to invest in the aging infrastructure. So that's what we've done.
I'll just chime in from Florida's perspective. That theme of the balancing of all of these things is what we're dealing with as well. both from the preservation versus new production standpoint, but also and where we're allocating the resources, and particularly for LIHTC in Florida. I think we're a little bit of an outlier that we do put a significant focus on a portion of allocating our 9% to developments that have local government support, local government financial support, and we give a state designated basis boost for that. But one really great thing for us that has come from that is that the local governments are more invested, I think, over the past 5 years than they've ever been before in how we are operating as a state housing finance agency. So we've started doing local government workshops specifically because we know those folks have some turnover over periods of time as well too. So they're very familiar with our cycle, and they're coming to us with questions as opposed to, or they're coming to us when a developer approaches them saying, that telling them what's happening. And so, but overall, it's been great. And we may talk about this in a little bit as well, but we've had significant local housing trust funds develop as well. So what's been great is that we're having these communications about how we can all leverage the resources in the best way possible. And so with all of that, we know that there is inherent risk in that as well. And we want to avoid situations with, over density of affordable housing or NIMBYism, and those kind of things. So we do balance as well with our in our QAP. We also have a state designated basis boost for geographic areas of opportunity, and it's a methodology that we do in house that balances census tracts with high performing education, income, and employment. And for us, we kind of see that as like, okay, that's our decent balance, that we're getting a little bit of everything going on. But it's something that we're having to be incredibly mindful of as well.
This is Mike. I wanted to mention something quite exciting in the Commonwealth of Virginia as part of Virginia Housing's engagement with our local government partners. In the city of Alexandria, which is in Northern Virginia, which is high growth, high cost community, we've been working very closely with the city of Alexandria, and they were able to use powers that they have essentially of local government in terms of land use and zoning decisions, is to essentially develop an approach whereby a rental assistance, project-based rental assistance development that was certainly in danger of being redeveloped over time to higher income rental housing, a process by which they were able to grant land use provisions and zoning provisions to be able to preserve those units of affordable housing, project-based rental housing, and increase the density available on that site for redevelopment. So that's particularly exciting because it's allowing local government to use the inherent power that they have in terms of land use and zoning decisions, provide density bonuses. And as part of this, they did a tremendous engagement with the surrounding community, involving the existing rental housing, but also the surrounding neighborhoods. And by virtue of that process, the engagement and the model that they've created, they're looking at taking that same approach in other parts of the city of Alexandria, again, to preserve affordable rental housing, but also create more of a mixed income, a mix of rental housing opportunities that over the long term is really going to strengthen the character and the opportunities in those particular areas. And then by extension, we're particularly excited about it because from Virginia Housing's perspective, it's providing a model that we can take to other communities that we're working with in terms of demonstrating how local powers can be used in a very effective manner to preserve affordable housing and advance other housing opportunities as well, including higher end affordable housing, as well as moving into market rate and workforce housing as well. So again, a very exciting model in the city of Alexandria, one that we think is going to prove to be very beneficial over time as part of this effort to preserve existing housing and advance rental housing opportunities overall.
So couple of things that have happened in Massachusetts that we've been a part of recently. For the first time in about 40 years, the legislature passed changes to our zoning laws. Massachusetts is a community in which every city and town can make changes to their zoning laws, but they need a super majority to do that. And one of the changes that the legislature did was to require a simple majority to do that. And while that may not sound like a big deal, but if you've got 7 folks voting, a supermajority is 5, right? And a simple majority is 4. And that can make all the difference in the world around whether you can zone for simple things like increased parking in your downtown and what that means for development. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as part of that bill, there was a requirement to have a multifamily zone in every community that has a hard stop for transportation. And so really trying to advance transportation oriented development around that. So what we've been doing with local communities is helping them think about the land that they control, and really trying to partner them early with developers as opposed to having the locality decide what they want, how many units it should sustain, and those kinds of things. It's like to partner with a developer early on so that you can decide those things together and come up with a feasible program, as opposed to the thing where, the locality decides, you put that out to bid, and the developer comes and says, yeah, but like I can't afford to do that. And so you run into these things where people get bought into that idea, and then you come back to the locality or the state and need more money than, so really trying to get them to work together early on. And so we call that program planning for production as opposed to just plans. It's like, how do we get closer to actually having production happen?
And I'm hearing a little bit of a theme, I feel, around partnerships. So Mike, you speak about at the state level working with the city. We talked in our previous question about working with developers or whoever it is to sort of have full buy-in into the success that everyone's trying to work towards. And so I appreciate hearing that. That's a positive thing, particularly as we're thinking about how to come out of this crisis and to plan better for the next one. And it sounds like one of the answers is it's all hands on deck, which I think we all know is the case. So Marissa, I want to give you the next question, but I have a feeling that everyone will probably have an opinion on this. We're talking about the rising costs of construction materials. So we've got these rising costs, construction materials and labor, and it's putting pressure on states to get creative to bring, how they're going to bring new rental units online. So as a part of this event, we recently heard from Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, and he commented on Miami's growing amount of construction, which is also aided by private sector involvement. So Marissa, you're in Florida. What are some of the innovative steps that your state is taking to support housing development in the community and how to navigate that during these times?
It feels like it's all we've been talking about for months. So literally public workshopping here last week, figuring out, how we're meeting folks in this really difficult moment. And I think the theme goes back to, exactly what we were just discussing, from an all hands on deck approach, really holistically with local government partners and developers, getting creative and bringing any and all resources to the table. In Florida, we are oversubscribed in all of our resources that we administer, but most significantly oversubscribed in our 9% LIHTC allocation. And so we had we were dealing with an interesting dynamic, which was developers saying, I've made it through. I've, cut corners where I could with, dealing with my land prices. I've value engineered. So if I don't need more money, you shouldn't be forward allocating these credits to folks who need it. So in any event, we had a different dynamic. I know a lot of states were able to look at, a forward allocation of credits type of scenario to meet the moment, but that was not going to work for us. And so we also have been very fortunate in that our board agreed to develop an approach to issue a viability loan program with unrestricted net position resources, which we duplicated when the equity markets kind of got crazy back in 2016. So we revisited that approach and learned some things from when we had done then. And so we're about to issue that competitive solicitation. But in doing that, one big difference that we made was that in the scoring, because we also believe we will be oversubscribed for that source, we are looking at folks who've come to the table and with additional commitments from their local governments as well, or other partner resources, be it grants or coming out from themselves as well too, just looking at everybody pitching in to meet in the moment. And we're also looking at a balance between that and honestly time. And what has been interesting is that now we hope and think, as things forecast, we may be on the other end of these issues, as we know they'll continue. And we've had some developments that have been able to roll up their sleeves, meet the moment, get through closing. And we're just, we're trying to educate our stakeholders and our board as well about how time in some ways can also be our friend in this moment too. So those are they're not super innovative, but, we're just trying to do anything. And, the thing that we have to think about, which it seems like almost every state does now as well too, is how disaster recovery plays into all of that as well. And we've been allocated specific disaster recovery resources. We're still dealing with long-term recovery from Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Michael, and Sally in the Panhandle. And so we really need to focus on making sure those resources get out the door. And so it's a lot, and everybody's got a lot going on, but we love our local government partners in that as well too. And yeah, that's where we're at. And so with that, we're also looking at prospective new production. How do we need to change what we're looking at with those things in mind? And I think front of mind for us is also making sure we understand leveraging the resources appropriately, especially with regard to resiliency. Climate change impacts, sea level rise, wind impacts, all these things that we're dealing with. It's everybody's dealing with it, we know. So we're trying to educate ourselves about how best to go about that as well too.
So I'll add a couple quick things in Connecticut. We have 2 housing agencies, so coordinating is sometimes problematic, but there are deals sort of in flight that are having issues with construction cost overruns. And so we have some resources, like we have a state tax credit. And so we're looking at using that for some of these deals to the extent that they're able to leverage more credit because they're, the basis has gone up and they're like eligible for more credits or more, on the 4% side, we can certainly issue more bonds or do something like that. We've had a few levers in terms of providing relief for projects that were, that have been placed in service dates that are approaching, that maybe we can give them some sort of regulatory relief there with the IRS's direction. But of course, we don't have any direction on the 2020 deals yet. In terms of filling gaps on new deals, that's where we're sort of really having to work and try to figure out with the Department of Housing how to do that best. And what we figured out is that because we both have our own soft resources and we're asking developers to go back and, as Marissa was saying, like go back and find other resources, go to the Federal Home Loan Bank, go to your lender, like figure out different ways that you can do value engineering and developer fee and all of that stuff. And once it's done and you still have a gap, like maybe there's a way that we could split the baby so that there are deals that the Department of Housing will take and provide other resources for, and then there are deals we'll take because we have the Capital Magnet Fund and we can use that as a soft resource. So we're finding that trying to sort of be more strategic about which deals and not having to have developers run through, go through like lots of circles, because then it's like 2 different closings and, trying to minimize the pain as much as possible. But there's no easy answer. And you're having to do a lot of work for every deal. And then you have equity pricing that could change because if you give them more credits, they have to give you more units potentially, right? Because we have equity caps. So there's all sorts of crazy madness and it's very iterative.
In Virginia, we've been very much engaged in looking at how to apply innovative approaches to the construction and the development process. For example, in our rental housing activity and within the low-income housing tax credit arena, we've been certainly looking at opportunities associated with modular housing and also utilizing modular housing and comparing it to the cost associated with stick-built and more traditional housing approaches from a rental perspective. We've also been very much involved in terms of looking at how to look at manufactured housing in terms of more effectively utilizing that as part of providing affordable housing opportunities at the local level. Again, keeping with the theme mentioned earlier in terms of partnerships, and particularly partnerships with localities in the southern part of Virginia and the city of Danville, they came to the table and have been very instrumental in terms of permitting the next generation of manufactured housing to come into their city. And in many localities, there has been an anxiety associated with manufactured housing. Much of that has to do with the perception of manufactured housing going back decades. But the state-of-the-art manufactured housing, and also the particular product that we were able to work closely with the city of Danville on, which is called Next Step Housing. The whole idea is to really enhance the curb appeal and the amenities associated with manufactured housing. So that's been very important from a home ownership perspective. And then also applying state-of-the-art manufactured housing in rural communities, particularly in rural rental development. So we have an example in rural Virginia where an existing manufactured housing community owner who owns both the pads, which is the land, as well as the units, certainly saw an opportunity to trade out all of these obsolete and in some cases very deteriorated manufactured housing units for state-of-the-art manufactured housing. So as a result of that, because of the cost involved and the cost savings involved and cost efficiencies, essentially we're going to have a rural rental housing community that's highly affordable and making it less likely that residents within those new units are going to have to rely on vouchers at the end of the day. Again, and it's because of the cost savings involved. And so there are some real opportunities looking at modular and manufactured housing, as well as some new innovative approaches as well. And something that we've been actively engaged in Virginia is around 3D printed housing opportunities. And right now that's focused on single story owner-occupied home ownership opportunities. Certainly lends itself to a rental model when you're talking again about single family type units, but also there's the potential for multifamily development as well associated with 3D printed homes. So again, exciting times in terms of looking at some existing technology and approaches that may not have been fully utilized, as well as some cutting edge technology associated with 3D printing.
Can't imagine that. It just sounds amazing. I mean, how far we've come with 3D printing. We can do housing with it. It's awesome.
Is anybody else doing any 3D printing of homes where you are?
We are not, but we just had in our community locally the first 3D printed home that's in the process of being built. It's remarkable. I mean, it's fascinating, and so we're eager to see where the technology goes.
Yep. Yeah, very good. I think that was my favorite response to any of our questions we've done so far, because everyone said we're all dealing with this. Everything is expensive. We're all trying to think creatively. So that was great. So I think we can wrap up with this question. And Mike, I'll turn it over to you first. I want to talk a little bit about public housing. So public housing represents an important rental housing resource in many communities. And so in recent proposals at the federal level, there's this recognition of the need to address the public housing capital funding backlog, which currently is estimated at greater than $70 billion needed. So we're wondering, how can state housing finance agencies partner with the public housing authority networks in their states to help address this issue of the backlog related to public housing? And maybe, Mike, you can offer some ideas that are specific to Virginia, but broader implications as well.
Well, that's an excellent question, because certainly in communities throughout the nation, public housing is a very important affordable rental housing resource. And nationwide, there are about a million units of public housing. And the backlog, as you mentioned, Laura, is estimated between $70 and $80 billion. I think what's particularly exciting right now in terms of the discussions in Washington around the Build Back Better initiative, that it's recognized that there is the need to address this capital fund backlog. And again, this has been coming for several decades in terms of capital funding for public housing not being sufficient to meet needs. When we look at this in the context of Virginia, we have a $25 public housing authorities. And if I refer to them as redevelopment and housing authorities, or RHAs, we have a unique situation in Virginia where our redevelopment authorities and our housing authorities are one entity. So that creates some unique opportunities in the state as well around community revitalization. But we have 25 public housing authorities with public housing portfolios in Virginia. And we estimate that the capital funding backlog is probably in the neighborhood of about $700 million. And overall, these units represent about 15,000 affordable rental units, project-based subsidized rental units, providing incredibly important housing opportunities for some of the most vulnerable populations in our communities. So one of the things that we've been doing is working very closely, and I think this applies really nationwide, is working very closely with our State Association of Housing and Community Development Officials. This is the local or the state affiliate of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, NARO. And this organization has been a very important partner with us over the years in terms of having discussions around opportunities to preserve and strengthen public housing as a valuable housing resource at the local level. In fact, a couple things that we've done working with our state association, which is called VOCTO in Virginia, is actually providing a capacity building grant for the organization for a strategic planning process that they recently undertook, which I think is very important in terms of setting forth the roadmap for the organization moving forward, particularly given the exciting opportunities we're hearing now around federal funding. The other thing that we've done, and this goes back to the early days of public housing revitalization under the Hope 6 initiative, which is probably about 2 decades ago when we saw that, and the successor now is the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, or CNI program under HUD. But early on in that process, we recognized that there was a great opportunity to essentially create a special set-aside under our low-income housing tax credit program for the public housing authorities in Virginia to be able to undertake, public housing renovation and rehabilitation and revitalization. So with the LIHTC program, our grant resources to support the state association, and then we've also been utilizing our capacity building grant to support individual redevelopment and housing authorities in Virginia, as well as they work to build their capacity. And then I referred to earlier the work that we did in Alexandria with the city of Alexandria. That falls under our community impact grant program. So providing community impact grants, which really help with some of the initial feasibility analysis and visioning associated with public housing revitalization, has also proven to be a very important opportunity associated with our engagement with the public housing authorities in Virginia. So this has really been an effort to continue to partner with our state association, build the capacity of the state association, but also build the capacity of the individual redevelopment and housing authorities as well, and utilize the low-income housing tax credit program, as well as the other lending programs that we have here at Virginia Housing, and working with them in a manner too that not only focuses on the 9% LIHTC program, but looking at how we can effectively utilize the 4% program in terms of advancing public housing revitalization. And certainly that was an approach originally envisioned by HUD when they rolled out the rental assistance demonstration program, was an emphasis on looking at the 4% program. Again, I think it was mixed in terms of the associated with that. But we've been working very closely in terms of how we can advance the 4% program as part of the discussion around revitalization. And also, I have to commend HUD that they've become, I think, much more receptive to various approaches in terms of how to revitalize public housing. Several years ago, the rental assistance demonstration program appeared to be the one approach that HUD was solely focusing on in terms of advancing revitalization. And it's become really a process and an approach that involves multiple opportunities, including looking at, for example, Section 18 demolition disposition, programs around mixed finance, LIHTC again with capital funds, as well as leveraging other resources. So it's become, again, a broader strategy on the part of HUD and a recognition that we really all have to work at this together in order to be successful in terms of preserving very important affordable rental housing at the local level in our public housing communities.
I think Mike said it all.
Right.
It knocked all of them, but in all honesty, I mean, well said. And in in Florida, we also are, have tried to do over the years, and it's evolved. But we work with our statewide association as well and get feedback from them, holistically, how they can meaningfully participate in our allocation process. And I think that we've gleaned very, very helpful feedback from them over time. We've developed metrics because, there's, to a certain extent, we do preferences or goals for the funding, but we've also tried to do some adjustments to how we look at our and scoring in terms of in many cases that, the site's the site. If we decide we want to do something interesting with proximity, that, we've got to leverage that out in some ways. So we've looked at those things, and we've looked at our acknowledging a higher, our total development cost limitations that we put in place, that we have something set aside for the PHAs to equalize them. So they're on a level playing field for the resources overall, because we're never going to hit that need just by doing a certain preference here or there. So we are looking at other ways always that we can have them meaningfully be participating. And it is it's a partnership.
In Massachusetts, we have about 45,000 units of state-supported housing. And so in addition to Boston, which is, of course, our largest city in Massachusetts, our capital city, Boston is the 9th largest housing authority in the country. And so there's a lot of focus around revitalizing on the federal side, and as well as revitalizing the state-supported public housing that we have there. And because, like others have talked about, the 9% credit, we generally only use that for new construction because we're such a high-cost state. And so the 4% credit becomes a thing in which we can drive toward the public housing. But in many of the communities that are under discussion here, you can't do significant new construction or even renovation project with just 4% credits. And so we have some of the Hope 6 projects, as well as neighborhood choice community choice neighborhood projects. I'm so sorry, Mike. And so we have that, but we also are really working to figure out how we might be able to use this opportunity with federal resources to have like a quick kind of like RAD type program for the state supported public housing, especially as part of the changes that the federal government are exploring is the changes to the 4% credit and what that might do in terms of allowing us to use that to be able to address some of the state side backlog. I mean, the real problem, if you can't get to RAD, then those deals can't support any debt. And so that makes the whole thing, well, not any debt, but like it's so nominal that it makes the whole thing really kind of difficult to put together. So in a state like Massachusetts, we definitely have to, do the cobbling of resources and figure out how we move toward that.
In Connecticut, it's very similar. I feel like we're sister states in some ways. We have a state-supported portfolio, which actually has a line item in the budget for capital needs for that portfolio. It's not much, but it's been helpful. I think the credit change will be a game changer, and that's where right now I think are you talking about the tax-exempt bond issuance, right? So like basically what it would be is if it went through, which is a big if. Right now, I think they require that in order to leverage the 4% credit, you need to issue at least 50% of the total cost of the project has to be funded through tax-exempt bond issuance. And they're going to change that number maybe and make it 25%, which just means that you'll have more capacity to do the stuff you need to do. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's, for us, we actually went the other way. We went from having a set aside for public housing to not in the QAP. And, you know, it's an interesting thing because we went back and forth. We actually talked to a number of housing authority leaders, and most of them were in favor of having the entire credit sort of allocation be available to them, because a number of them partner with developers and they could come in under the new construction or the preservation, and they would, depending on what they're trying to achieve, they can get funded. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you for your anybody else have 2 cents? Well, thank you, everybody, Marissa, Nandini, Crystal, and Mike, for your time on this panel today and your expertise. This has been a great conversation with a couple of themes running through it that I think, we're leaving our audience with a few things to think about. So we wish you the best of luck in your state where you are as you continue to address all of these issues, not just as a part of this current crisis, but going forward as well. And this was a very refreshing conversation. Great to hear your insights on how state level government can best leverage those federal policies and other mechanisms to advance resilient, affordable housing. So thank you all very much for being with us. And
thank you.
Yes, and at this point, I'd like to turn the proceedings over to Eric Price, who is the Executive Vice President at the NHP Foundation.
Good evening. I'm Eric Price, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at NHPF. Let's take a moment to let all of this important conversation sink in. We are thankful to all of our participants for sharing their ideas and expertise with us tonight. We look forward to the report we will produce and distribute to all of you. It will lay the groundwork for important next steps the industry should take to shore up vulnerable, affordable housing and employ more creative strategies to make considerable changes in the lives of people experiencing housing insecurity. As we consider how to develop and implement the best strategies, let's hear from a bold activist and speaker who will likely inspire us all, as she has in past speeches, highlighting racial and social disparities that must be overcome in order to provide truly equitable opportunities to all Americans. You may think you know Kimberly Latrice Jones from a viral 7-minute video, How Can We Win?, which she recorded following the killing of George Floyd. The video, which has been viewed millions of times and shared by the likes of Trevor Noah and John Oliver, makes the story of Black poverty in America accessible through its comparisons to a rigged game of Monopoly. But Kimberly Jones is so much more than a popular video. She's an award-winning author, director, and riveting speaker. Let's hear her thoughts on allyship in the affordable housing ecosphere.
I am so excited to be talking to the NHP Foundation. I look forward to the day when I can do this with you guys in person. But as for now, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who is watching. This is a conversation that is much needed, that I am excited to be a participant in. And I hope that you walk away with something interesting. I wanted to talk about the last 10 years and how that has affected housing and what it looks like and how we can move forward. But honestly, it's very difficult to do that without talking about what has happened throughout the housing journey, particularly of African Americans in this country. So we can't be surprised to learn that in 2021, at the time of this lecture, white people hold 90% of the wealth in the US. They are not 90% of the population, but they hold 90% of the wealth. And I attribute a large portion of that to housing. In fact, there are less than 60% of the population, yet still holding 90% of the wealth. And African Americans, although just over 13% of the population, only possess 2.6% of the wealth. And again, I connect that all back to the housing, especially since between 1925 and 1965, the US government underwrote $200 billion in lending for home ownership. And of that $200 billion, the recipients of the government money were almost exclusively, 98% to be exact, white presenting people. And during the push to get white people into homes, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, a government-sponsored bank for mortgage lending, which was able to create programming and systems similar to what we're seeing the SBA do with small business loans right now, in the 1930s, they were coded by income and race. Areas that already had a significant Black and immigrant population appeared on those maps in red as neighborhoods where the HOLC would not lend. So this is the beginning of redlining. And this is what leads us to where we are today. So when we talk about the devastation of what has happened in the housing market in the last 10 years, we have to talk about that. I had to start with that because that impacts why people were not able to recover, why people didn't have the financial literacy and the housing literacy to recover, and why we are still looking at a massive wealth gap. We are looking at a wealth gap where the median income for white families in the US is $170,000, but the median income for Black families is $17,000. That's a huge gap that we can't deny has to have a root somewhere. And I think what I was talking about previously with the housing gap is the root of that. We want to know how we can move forward on these things, because I think at this point, all of us are in a place where that's where we want to be. We want to see progress. We want to see what next steps look like. We want to see where do we go from here to make sure that we are taking care of the unhoused, that we are making sure that people can take care of themselves, that people can provide for a family, and that people can ensure that if nothing else is strained, if nothing else is insecure, that their housing is secure. We want to build a housing secure nation, because housing insecurity, as horrific as it has been, and especially it has been hardest hit in the last 10 years, is probably one of the biggest issues related to the wealth gap. And guess what? Low income, impoverished communities have higher crime rates. And so what we're talking about is, how do we deal with crime? Well, we deal with crime by dealing with poverty. How do we deal with poverty? Well, we deal with poverty by dealing with home ownership. There's a lot of conversation about what can be done in next steps. And a lot of times what people are looking at is low income housing. But I think that the conversation needs to switch to, how do we move towards a program similar to that of what we saw in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, that allotted $200 billion in US government funding being underwritten to make sure that the suburbs and that the white middle class Americans were able to build generational wealth through home ownership is extended to the rest of America. And so I think even when talking about doing low income housing, that it should be a two-pronged system, a two-step system, that as we get people into low income housing so that they can no longer be home insecure and unhoused, the next step of all of those programs should be a road to ownership. That is what is going to put everyone in a closer playing field in terms of wealth, in terms of public safety, and in terms of reconciling with America's original sin, which to me was not following through with the plans that were set during Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau that was run by General Oliver Howard was put in place because he was supposed to be in charge of the transition from formerly enslaved people into society. Now, many people have heard the phrase and the term 40 acres and a mule, that African Americans did not receive the reparations that were promised to them, which was the 40 acres and a mule. But where that statement is really rooted in is what General Oliver Howard was doing with the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau the amount of funding it was given for the year was what they spent in 1 week on the war. So he didn't have a whole lot of funding to run the Bureau. But what he did have was acres and acres and acres of land. And this is when he started to give out the 40 acres that we speak of in that term. And he actually began to give it out. But once Lincoln was shot, and Johnson took office, he put in place systems that allowed for people to take the 40 acres back, which was extremely unfortunate because you left thousands and thousands of formerly enslaved people not only without an ability to earn an income, because many of them were farming on that land in order to earn an income, but you left them unhoused. And that system started a windmill where you go into what I talked about with the HOLC, and you go into the redlining of communities, and you go into insurance systems that still affect these communities that made the last 10 years where the entirety of the country was hardest hit by home insecurity, by lending insecurity, by predatory lending, put us at an even more severe disadvantage. So how do we fix that now? Again, we fix that by a two-step system, getting people in low income housing so that they are no longer unhoused, but then continuing the program, a secondary piece to the program that gives them a road to home ownership. And you can dig around in as much as you can, but there has been several studies that prove when people own homes and when people have the financial backing of home ownership, crime is reduced in those neighborhoods, jobs move into those neighborhoods, medical facilities move into those neighborhoods in order to service those communities. So I think when you look at the multi-pronged issues that are affecting Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in this nation, I think housing is the most key, critical, and important tool to fixing that. And I hope with this gives you just a nugget of information that you need to like run off into the stars and find more information and look at programs and countries and places like Norway who have done exactly that, who have created two-pronged systems where they take their unhoused people, they get them housing, and then they transition them with job, financial literacy programs, credit repair programs, and first-time home lending programs coupled as a package. Housing works hand in hand with financial institutions to make sure that not only are these people in a position where they can get the house, but they have the financial literacy and they have the trade school education, they have the economic education in order to maintain these homes. I think that you combat so many prongs of systemic racism that has affected Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in this nation with housing, that it's the key. It is the key, which is why I was so excited to speak with you guys today. I have been waiting and desiring deeply to speak to people in the housing and who oversee housing programs, because this is the key. Housing is the key. Housing not only is it the key in terms of economics, but it's the key in terms of morale. I mean, everybody from the hood to the holler would be in a better position, would be looking forward to their day-to-day lives if they were able to be less housing insecure, if they could take pride and ownership in the neighborhoods in which they live in. And then at that point, there's again, tons of studies out there that you guys can research. I will send over some links for later that you could look at that shows that housing pride, taking pride in your home, is rooted in ownership. It is rooted in the ownership of that home. And that's when people are participants in community cleanups, whether they have the support of the government or not. This is when you see people start to show up at city council meetings and are involved in what is happening in their community, that are requesting that there are street sweepers in their community, that are engaged in what's happening with the city council or aldermen or whoever is controlling city policy. Again, all linked to ownership. So although I think it is very important especially in this very fragile time right after COVID that left many, many people housing insecure, that we get people housed, and that also we create housing for those who have neurodiversity. And so that we're making sure that our citizens who are living with mental health concerns are properly housed and have the services that they need, which again should be coupled. We should definitely be looking at more housing programs that couple mental health and drug addiction recovery systems to help our unhoused citizens. But also, once we get people who are lower income, and let's be honest, in this market, middle income, housing secured, our next step is to lend them a road to ownership. And you can definitely do the research to see that as people owned more homes, both white, Black, brown, indigenous, all of them in the 60s, where the road to home ownership was far more favorable and there was a lot less predatory lending, you saw a lot less criminal activity, crime was lower. We were able to properly house our public safety and policing systems so that we had beat cops that interacted with the community. So you had a whole lot less of these types of shootings because you knew the people in your neighborhood if you were policing that neighborhood, and you lived in that neighborhood if you were policing in that neighborhood. I could go on all day, but I'll leave you guys with this. You fix housing and you begin to fix it all. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Kimberly, for sharing your insights with us tonight. By learning lessons from the past and applying them to healthy, equitable partnerships with allies today and in the future, we will provide abundant housing opportunities that will help socially marginalized people succeed. We can't thank you enough. And we can't thank all of our sponsors, attendees, and participants enough either. What a night of learning and what a night of celebrating those who make our industry strong and viable. We like to leave you with the knowledge that this evening's important information and data will be captured in a report that you will all receive. And we hope it keeps you inspired and engaged to reach your own individual goals with regards to providing housing that could withstand whatever the next decade brings. We also wish everyone continued good health and look forward to seeing everyone in person when the time is right. Thank you all again for being part of NHP Foundation's 5th Annual Symposium.